Top of the morning, Dan and Amy. I'll tell you what, every day I'm getting closer and closer to becoming a Kentucky libertarian.
Really?
Like Rand Paul or Tom Massey. At least when it comes to the quote-unquote deep state. And I say this because of the Wall Street Journal editorial pushing for a renewal of Section 702T of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. It's up for renewal soon. Congress is going to take it up. And the argument goes something like this. This is from the Wall Street Journal editorial board. A report on the Section 702 and the Act released by the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board. And there's some recommendations. They recommend renewal, but there's some recommendations that the Wall Street Journal characterizes would, quote, add bureaucratic delays in intelligence gathering and undermine 702's utility. For example, they would add that a U.S. person, because this is supposed to be for intelligence gathering on foreign nationals, not Americans, they would add, the panel recommended, that a U.S. person in query should be allowed if deemed reasonably likely to retrieve foreign intelligence or evidence of a crime. The chair of this panel wanted probable cause to be the standard, and the Wall Street Journal argues that would gut the program. It would make it easier for al-Qaeda or ISIS to plant agents in the U.S. who could evade detection. Plant them? All they have to do is send them up through the southern border. What's this planting business? So they sort of gloss over the abuse story from this past summer. You haven't forgotten, have you? The FBI improperly used Section 702 to spy on Americans, essentially. 278,000 times in 2020 and 2021. Queries for Black Lives Matter and January 6th protesters, among others. And I got to tell you, I want to defer to the national security experts generally, but I'm long ago done completely giving the benefit of doubt to the experts because they're just so often wrong. And I'm not so sure anymore that I trust those in positions that to which there's so much power attendant to make the judicious decisions and the balancing act between the desire to provide for our national security and the respect for our constitutional rights. I'm sorry, I'm just not giving this group, regardless of the president, frankly, the benefit of the doubt anymore. Maybe that's too cynical. For more on this, we're pleased to be joined by Elbridge Colby, co-founder and principal of the Marathon Initiative. He served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Strategy and Force Development from 2017 to 2018. He's also the author of the book, The Strategy of Denial, American Defense in an Age of Great Power Conflict. Elbridge Colby, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Great to be with you. Thanks.
What's your view on 702?
I honestly don't know enough about the specific details. Look, I think what you were saying, I share a lot of your concern. I think a lot of the sort of national security establishment's sort of state has not covered itself with glory, both in the kind of general sense of the last 20, 25 years has not been successful at all for American foreign policy. And then specifically a number of abuses where a lot of the people who've been involved have basically gotten away scot-free. So I think there are real concerns about accountability, and I think those need to be forthrightly addressed. And that was the whole point of the process of setting up congressional oversight 50 years ago in the wake of the abuses that were revealed in the 1970s. At the same time, there are a lot of bad people out there, terrorists, Chinese spies, Russians, et cetera. So I don't think we should, my view is we need an effective national security state. Back 200 years ago, we could go without it, and that was great, but we don't live in that world anymore. But we need it to be under the control, and they need to understand that they're under the control of the democratic, powers and ultimately the people.
Yeah, but here's the rub. I don't disagree with that statement, but here's the rub. You write about this in your piece in The Spectator, your recent piece in The Spectator. You can have all the intelligence, lawful, constitutionally compliant intelligence in the world. But then if you make terrible policy decisions, it's sort of all for naught. And that
Correct.
seems to be where we're at right now when it comes to advancing America's interests globally.
Yeah, I think we're in really, really serious danger. I mean, look, for years, for decades, we've been hearing that we're living in the world's in the most dangerous time. I used to roll my eyes and laugh at that when it was said in like 2005. I mean, 9/11 was obviously a horrible thing, but in the 1950s, people were hiding under their desks in their basements because they thought there was going to be a thermonuclear war. So it was a ridiculous statement. Today, actually, I do think we are in the most dangerous situation since the 1960s, in particular because I think China is doing everything that seems to be consistent with preparing for a war with us. And China is the first peer economy we've really ever faced, certainly since the last 150 years. So this is a really unprecedented situation. And, we may not be interested in conflict. I certainly don't want a conflict, but they're preparing for one. And they can start one whether we like it or not. And at the same time, everybody's kind of, it's changing now, but people have been sort of very spiking the football over the Ukraine situation. The Ukraine situation does not look good. I mean, leaving aside what's going on right now with the aid, my personal view is we should support the Ukrainians at a lower level that's consistent with focusing on China. But, the war is very likely to be protracted. It's an attritional conflict which is going to be consuming. So, all of this sort of self-satisfied kind of approach over the last year and a half has really not led to a good place. So I look at our foreign policy. I also think back 25 years ago, let's say the year 2000, the United States was by far the world's largest economy. We had an almost balanced budget. We weren't at war with anybody. China and Russia were not a serious threat, et cetera. And now you look today, financial crisis, failed wars, unchecked immigration, for instance, et cetera, and you think to yourself, that is an incredibly poor performance, and yet the same people who have presided over that are now still in positions of power.
Well, it seems to me, just thinking about this and wonder what your perspective is on how the Chinese Communist Party views this. But, we sort of, our policy, our geopolitical policies are sort of to the approach is sort of virtue signal and throw money around. Make sure everybody gets the Ukrainian flag as their Facebook photo.
Right.
And then let's spread some money around, and we'll have confabs, and we'll have these photo opportunities with Zelensky and his battle gear and so on and so forth. So we'll sort of do like a PR campaign, and we'll throw money around, and we'll talk a little bit tough, and we'll wag our finger. Is anybody buying? It's one thing. The Chinese communists have to be looking at this and saying, well, Russia's certainly not as strong as we thought. So, that ally of convenience may not be as useful as we thought. But maybe they're saying the same thing. America's not as formidable as we thought either.
Well, that's, I think, clearly what they think. And actually, the fact that Russia is in the position has a lot of advantages for China because it makes Russia more dependent on China. A strong Russia would be one that have much more independence vis-a-vis Beijing. Yeah, I have the same view. I think a lot, particularly under the Biden administration, it's so much about the optics. How many times is the president going to be at some gala event with G7 or EU or NATO leaders in like the Bavarian Alps or in like some fawning, European population that's loving it. And you look at the substance underlying it or the results and it's different, right? There's all these like, I left my heart in Kiev, for instance, and yet here we are with an attritional conflict. And then you look at how, he's talking a big game. I'm just struck by how the president talks a lot of, frankly, smack about Xi Jinping. And a lot of it's about, your economy's bad. Like we have all these allies. You look at the meeting he had with the Prime Minister of Japan, the President of South Korea, or the AUKUS stuff. A lot of good stuff. But at the end of the day, whether Biden is a realist, I'm pretty sure that Xi Jinping is a realist. Like that guy ascended an incredibly lethal political ladder. And here he is, and he's building up military power. He's building up economic power. And I think they do think that we're a paper tiger, actually. That's the evidence that they think we're in decline. I think there's huge problems with our country. I don't think we're necessarily in decline. But at the end of the day, this is pretty simple, which is that we need to have the hard military power to persuade Xi Jinping that he's not going to succeed. And, all the photo ops at Camp David ain't going to stop it. Or the way I put about it, you're not going to stop a Chinese invasion of Taiwan with, Taiwan flag hashtags. And I think there are a lot of people who kind of think that.
It's Michelle Obama, bring back our girls hashtag. And that's how you're going to get Islamic
Exactly.
terrorists in Africa to return girls they kidnapped. As we've been doing this for a while, actually, particularly under, these two presidents who are joined at the hip politically and otherwise. I mean, just on that score, with respect to China and Taiwan. And our military, you talk about our hard military buildup. A lot of people are saying this, and I'm skeptical of the military-industrial complex too, as we were discussing. But I mean, Seth Cropsey, the former Undersecretary of the Navy, had a piece in the Journal the other day talking about how depleted our submarine fleet is. We've talked to other military experts who talk more generally about the armed services. We're not where we need to be prepared to present a strong front to all the threats that a free Western world faces. And so, I mean, what's your view of where we should be there as we're, piling up debt with funny money and $33 trillion worth?
Yeah, we're definitely not where we want to be. I mean, there's more attention to the China problem, and we're doing some things, but we're not keeping pace. It's all relative. China's under an unprecedented military buildup, according to this, left-wing administration. So, and Seth Cropsey and others are absolutely right that our naval forces, our air forces, they're not where they need to be. And, we're kind of peacocking around. And my basic point is that's the thing we need to get absolutely right, because we don't want to get into a war with China. I don't want to get into war with China. But unfortunately, if they attack Taiwan and we don't do anything, that's the beginning of the problem, which is going to be much worse, not the end of it. So the best thing is to be as strong as possible and basically present the Chinese with the idea like, I'm not going to succeed. And what's so frustrating, particularly on the right often, is voices that are calling for a sort of a tough line on Ukraine are also calling for a tough line on Iran and North Korea and yada, 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 and then also China. And it's like, hey, what planet are you living on, in the sense of, huge funny money. We know our military is not in good shape relative to the challenges that we face. We know we're racking up huge amounts of debt. So where is the reckoning with the seriousness of the problem? And I mean, you go back to like Reagan. A lot of people talk about Reagan, who was a great president, but like Reagan wasn't, he understood the problem. You needed to grow the economy. You needed to recognize the severity of the threat. And by the way, that our debt levels were far, far lower at that time. Our tax burden was lower. I mean, I'm not exactly sure on all that. But I mean, we need to live in the real world where you can't just build one submarine from one day to the next and pretend like you can. We need to live in the world where we are, and that's why I wrote that piece in the Spectator, is to say, wake up, America. We are in a really dangerous situation, and it could change from one day to the next because the Chinese have an incentive to be as surprising as possible if they move on Taiwan.
Do you have any handicapping of the likelihood that China would invade Taiwan, say, before Biden's term is up?
I really, I mean, modesty, tells me and sort of intellectual sort of integrity, I hope, is saying to me, I can't offer a specific probability, but what I'll do is I'll spin it around and say they are acting, I would say almost in every single major way as a country that is preparing for war. Now, what their particular decision making is, what their timeline is, I don't know. But, the way I think about it is that if it walks like a duck and talks like a duck and quacks like a duck, maybe it's a duck. I mean, they're conducting exercises to take on the United States and fight over Taiwan. They're building up their nuclear forces. They're preparing their economy for large-scale sanctions. Why would you have large-scale sanctions? Because you're in a war with the United States. They appear to be politically conditioning their population to be ready for struggle and sacrifice and suffering. Why would you have that? Why are you stockpiling wheat and oil and gas? Why are you diversifying your energy sources away from like the Straits of Malacca more, or and more towards Russia or other routes? Those are all consistent. Again, I think it's a huge issue for China. It's a huge roll of the dice, and so we have that going for us. But we are really pushing our luck.
Elbridge Colby, co-founder and principal of the Marathon Initiative. He served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Strategy and Force Development from 2017 to 2018, and his book, The Strategy of Denial, American Defense in an Age of Great Power Conflict. Elbridge Colby, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Great to be with you. Thanks.
Thank you. And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
Connect with Dan and Amy using the AM560 mobile app. Download it today at 560theanswer.com/mobile.
Let's see, if something costs less, but people are happier with it, that sounds like something to look into, and that is MediShare. Maybe you've heard switching to MediShare to pay for healthcare can save many families up to $500 a month, and that is huge. But it's also true that people are way more satisfied after making the switch, too. The member satisfaction rate for MediShare is double that of the typical health insurance plan. Double. MediShare works, too. It's been around for 30 years. Members have shared more than $5 billion of each other's bills. People love having telehealth and a huge nationwide PPO network. So, yeah, really, you can save a ton and like it better. Imagine being happy with how you're taking care of your health care. So if you're self-employed or part of the gig economy, or you just want a plan you're happy with, you can call right now. You'll get a price within